Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Chakra Meditation Podcast. I'm Roseanne, and I've got a lovely another guest for you today. So today I'm talking to Bill Belanger, who is a meditation teacher, a former therapist, and I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation because Bill's speciality, if you like, is Tibetan Buddhism. And we're going to see where the intersection of Tibetan Buddhism and Western psychology sits, because I think this is a really juicy and interesting place for those of us in the Western world who are, going deep into our inner work and our spirituality. Where does it sit alongside Western psychology? So hopefully, Bill's got all the answers. Hello and welcome, Bill.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome indeed. So first, my first question is going to be because obviously everybody knows what Buddhism is, or they have a rough idea at least of what Buddhism entails. So tell me a little bit about Tibetan Buddhism as a particular type of Buddhism, as opposed to any other types.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, there's different types of Buddhism. So Theravadan Buddhism, which is more of the early Buddhist schools. So that's practiced mostly in Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. Then there's more Mahayana Buddhism, which is practiced a little bit more widely. So China, Japan, South Korea. And then Tibetan Buddhism, I would say, is under the umbrella of Mahayana, but they also have Vajrayana Buddhism, which is considered a more, I guess, advanced form of Buddhism or it integrates a lot of other practices. So it's really interesting talking with people because the differences within the Buddhist schools are very significant. It's almost, in my mind, hard to compare them as one thing at times. Like
Oh,
there's definitely a
really?
lot of fundamental similarities, but there's a lot of very significant differences. So
Okay.
for me, I've experimented for a long time, but my heart is in the Tibetan tradition, and that's where I've resonated the most. So yeah, very different flavor from some other forms of Buddhism. Sometimes a little bit more inaccessible, unfortunately, because of a lot of cultural baggage.
Right.
But yeah, I'm very passionate about it. I'm a big believer in it.
So can you give me a few examples of where it differs? Because, I'm no expert, and I'm not assuming that anybody else listening is an expert in
Yeah.
Buddhism. There will be people who are experts in Buddhism and go, "Oh my God, Roseanne, you should know this." But I don't know this. I'm holding my hands up. So the sort of the Buddhism that is practiced in the Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, that area, and then there's the Buddhism that's practiced in Japan, China, those kind of areas, and then there's Tibetan Buddhism. So what puts Tibetan Buddhism apart from those? Like, give me a few like really basic examples that I can grasp onto.
Yeah, and I also just say up front, it depends on your vantage point how you answer this. So the Tibetan Buddhists think their Buddhism is the best, and the Theravadins think their Buddhism is the best. So we're
Well,
all
don't all
biased.
religions? I know, and there
Yeah.
was I thinking that the Buddhists were the people who were just like all peaceful, and it was all the other religions in the world who thought their religion was the best. But it's quite comforting to know that the Buddhists think that as well. That's
Yeah, there can be some pretty fierce disagreements, at least more intellectually and debate
yeah,
wise. I'd say broadly speaking, there's Theravada can sometimes be called Hinayana Buddhism, which means small vehicle. So the goal arguably is a little bit different. They might contest this, but from the Tibetan view, it's more about self-liberation from suffering. Whereas the Mahayana, it means great vehicle. It's basically we want to help everybody. It's a little bit more grounded in compassion. And so I was actually speaking with somebody about this yesterday, but a concrete example is in some of the Theravadan traditions, some of the more difficult emotions or energies, so anything from sexual energy or aggressive energy, the approach to dealing with that, I would argue, is a little bit more monastic. You don't really go there. They're just seen more as problematic. And this is because these are monastic traditions,
yeah,
largely. You shave your head and you don't have any possessions and you're in a monastery. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has a little bit more tolerance of these things, and it's more about transmuting difficult energies into wisdom. So it's a little bit more of embracing of that. There's also more
Mm.
traditions within Tibetan Buddhism where you don't have to be monastic, where you can either have a family or you don't even have to live in a monastery at all. So there's a pretty broad variety of practices and style within Tibetan Buddhism. It's very, very diverse.
Yeah.
Um, So the Tibetan Buddhist practice too, all different types of practices and visualizations and mantras, and it's really, really broad tradition. So yeah, again, we could get into the nitty-gritty, but
Mm.
there's definitely a very different feeling to both of the different traditions, I find.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting because, as I don't know, as people, I was going to say as Westerns, but as people, we all have difficult emotions. We have difficult emotions like jealousy or anger or resentment. Like these are really kind of pernicious emotions that can really eat us up. And I'm of the opinion that we need to really, we need to work. If we shove those emotions down, we are asking for energetic trouble later down the line.
Hmm.
We're asking for physical issues to throw themselves up down the line if we're not going to challenge or at least process and look through these emotions. So I completely am with you on that, and I find that that's really fascinating. That there are some traditions of Buddhism that are just like, no, we're not going to go there. Just suck it up and go back to your meditation cushion. That's interesting.
And I think it's important to always think of these traditions in terms of their original context or in the way that they're practiced in these countries. So I
Mm.
never mean to denigrate any of the traditions. I'm more interested in terms of what works for Westerners. So
Yeah,
I do think that if you're a man, because a lot of them are more male-centered traditions. If you're a man and you're in a monastery, there's a reason that they have these traditions because they do work. And it
mm.
makes sense if you don't have a family, if you don't have a job, if you don't have a lot of these normal stresses, you can really focus on working
Yeah,
with the mind. And a
yeah,
lot of the nitty-gritty stuff that we have as householders doesn't come up. You don't have to work with it at the same level.
yeah.
But for me, I have a 2-year-old son right now. I have a home and a partner and sometimes a very stressful job.
Mm.
It's a different situation. So the
Yeah,
context is very different.
yeah. And no, it
So
absolutely is.
yeah,
And it would be sometimes it would be very nice to think I can just go and live in a monastery and
yeah.
not have any because there's very little responsibility with that. And I think, with the Western world has, we lump a lot of responsibility on people to provide, just to exist in the Western world takes a lot of energy and responsibility. And you take all of that away, and yeah, there's less going to be less anger and resentment and all those
Yeah.
difficult emotions to deal with. Yeah. So how did you come to this? What was your in to Tibetan Buddhism or Buddhism as a whole?
Yeah, for some reason as a teenager, I was always really fascinated by Buddhism, but I didn't really understand it. So I started buying books as a teenager. When I went to college, I learned mindfulness, and then I eventually did a trip to Bhutan and India. So it was
Oh,
kind of where I was first immersed in Tibetan Buddhism. Then later, after graduating, I went back to Asia and spent time backpacking and did a month retreat in a monastery in Nepal.
oh,
So I kind of immersed myself. I also did retreats in Thailand in the Theravadan tradition. I practiced Zen in the States. So I definitely dabbled in a lot of different traditions. And then
mm,
I eventually found my own teacher in Massachusetts who was a really interesting figure who was a psychologist at Harvard, but he was a translator of Tibetan Buddhist texts. So he was the person that I had been traveling to Asia and doing all these retreats, but the first time I met him, he had these weekly meditation meetings. I just basically immediately knew, okay, this is my teacher. This is what I've been
yeah.
searching for. So I practiced with him for about 10 years until he passed a few years ago. So, but for him, the thing that really helped me was he had his feet in two worlds, both clinical psychology, but also really traditional Tibetan practice, but he was able to translate a lot of it. And
Mm,
for me, I think I could have spent decades reading Tibetan Buddhist books and I wouldn't really have gotten them. So he was the person that for me connected a lot of the dots.
yeah,
So more than anything was working with that teacher that yeah, centered me in the
yeah,
Tibetan tradition.
yeah. I mean, I think that this is definitely the work that I find myself up against as well, because as you know, my main modality that I use as the foundation for all the work that I do is the chakra system, which is an ancient Indian, Hindu, whatever you want to call it, like tradition. But I translate it into very practical, grounded Western way of understanding it so that people can understand. And feels like you doing the same. So this intersection of Tibetan Buddhism and psychology is really, really fascinating. So I know did you say you were writing a book on this subject? Is this
Yeah,
the
correct.
subject of your book? Okay, so you're the person to ask about this. So what are and this is just a really annoying question because I want to know, but what are you finding is the biggest difference? Where's the biggest gap, the biggest place where Western psychology and Tibetan Buddhism just do not agree?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a few ways that they're pretty fundamentally different. So yeah, let's start with that. It's interesting too because the field of psychology is changing dramatically right
Mm,
now, and it's so influenced by meditation and mindfulness that there's a little bit of a merger with some of these things.
hmm
So even evidence-based practices like DBT, they draw on things like Zen and mindfulness. So that line is getting blurry. But
Yeah.
traditionally, the way I would answer that is so Freud in his book Civilization is Discontents, he says that psychoanalysis deals with neurotic suffering, but it doesn't deal with the everyday suffering, basically of being a human being. So it's more if we have anxiety or depression or trauma, you can go to therapy and we can help you to deal with that to be a functioning normal person. But that's kind of traditionally where therapy stops. It's not as much dealing with the existential unhappiness that we all have. So Buddhism kind of picks up where therapy leaves off, where Buddhism is not a psychotherapy technique, and they're not always as sophisticated, frankly, at dealing with things like anxiety and depression and personality disorders and these types of things. But
Mm,
they're dealing more with that existential piece of why are we unhappy. So it's more the chronic reactivity that the mind has, or the way that we fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the self. So this is kind of the big difference is Buddhism's vision is much bigger, I would argue, but it's more universal, whereas the Western therapy approach, it's more on what are the problems I'm dealing with emotionally today, but
mm,
it might not have that more transcendent experience of seeing beyond the sense of self, things like that. So there's other important differences, but that's probably where I'd start as the
mm.
fundamental tension.
Yeah. So yes, I mean it's it's interesting when you were saying that I was just thinking that way back. I mean, I'm older than you, so but I remember let's say like 80s, early 90s, and in America um, therapy was definitely a thing, like that was becoming very much more popular, probably a little bit earlier than that, but definitely into the 80s and into the 90s. And over here in the UK, therapy was not a normal thing. You know, as usual, we're usually a few years behind in the cultural kind of things like that. But I remember, you know, my mum, who's a wonderful skeptic and bright woman, but very skeptical about all these things, and she's like, "Oh, it's just navel gazing. It's just people just looking at they just need to look up and
Hmm.
look out and get out of their own, you know, they're just." Too worried about themselves. They just need to go and do something for somebody else. Now, this is very good advice. Um,
Mhm.
However, it does point up that difference that therapy is very much, well, tell me how you're feeling and tell me about your parents and tell me about your this and, you know, how you're feeling. And the Buddhism takes it out and goes, you know, but you're just a speck of dust and actually get a grip. So it's like
Yeah,
my mother was a
it's
Buddhist before her time.
yeah, and it's interesting. I find there's a healthy tension and a balance between the traditions.
Hmm.
Another way to talk about it that I'm writing in my book is how if we analyze our experience, we have mental content is a term we could use for thoughts, emotions, perceptions. So there's different theories of why we're unhappy. So a therapy technique might say, well, you're having negative emotions, you're having maladaptive beliefs, and we can work to help you to have more positive emotions, have less depressive symptoms, to have beliefs that are more in touch with reality. So we're working on the level of mental content. Whereas
Hmm.
Buddhism is working on the level of awareness. It's less about any mental experience and it's more about how we relate to that experience.
Hmm.
So they would argue that it's more, we have this fundamental reactivity of mind where we go towards things that we like and we try to hold on to them and cling. We push away things that we don't like and try to get rid of them, or we dissociate. So that those are called the three poisons in Buddhism. So the antidote is my at this stage of practice is mindfulness, where we're just learning to basically be present with whatever is arising without preference ultimately. So
Hmm.
again, I think there's a balance because there's this great quote I'm using in my book from Mark Epstein, who's a psychologist and a Buddhist, but basically he says something that Buddhist practice generally doesn't do much to help with people's emotional problems or meditation in general, which is a lot of people don't understand. So you might have these really difficult emotional patterns or relational difficulties. If you're a good Buddhist and you practice, you can be very non-reactive about them, which is great. You can be present with them, but you still might have to see a therapist to kind of work on the nitty-gritty and the stuff that you have to work with on the content level. So again,
Mm.
they're kind of two sides of the same coin, I find, and that's why I'm very much a fan of the integration of them rather than saying
Yeah.
like only Buddhist or only therapy. I think they both have something very important to offer.
Yeah, no, I really hear you, and I'm finding it fascinating listening to you explain this because it resonates very hard with the kind of the way that I like to work with my clients as well,
Mhm.
which is, we'll work out energetically what's going on, and then we'll refer that back to, okay, yes, your parental stuff or your job or your relationship or your money issues. And then, so we're getting into the kind of nitty-gritty of like the thoughts and the feelings, and then we'll take a step back and look at the bigger picture. So
Mm.
it's a fascinating thing to look at as a bigger. So how are you bringing this into your work? Because you work with, I know you work with individuals, you work in the corporate world as well. So you bring this into, workplaces as well. Your company, Healbright, that's mostly corporate stuff, isn't it? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, so in the corporate world, it's usually toned down. So it's very different
Yeah.
between an individual who wants to do depth work and is interested in spirituality. So that's more and more where my heart is. Within the corporate world, it's more the language is stress reduction, resilience. We do like communication training, that type of thing. So there's
Yeah.
just very different, we'd say,
Mm.
buyer profiles or what the people are interested. So we try to meet people where they're at.
Yeah.
So I'll do coaching with founders, with like business founders. We can get really in depth for the founders that are interested in that. But generally for the corporate world, it's more just a low-hanging fruit and skills training and that
Yeah.
type of
Yeah.
stuff.
So, in terms of when what are you finding is the most sort of important piece of the puzzle here? When people, because I'm imagining that the majority of your clients and the people you work with have an idea they've probably done some therapy, they've done some, they've been to see a psychologist or a therapist of some sort, and so they're familiar with that way of working. So what is it when you bring in the Tibetan Buddhism that they find the most sort of challenging or the most striking? What is it? Which part of it makes the is the has the biggest impact, do you find?
Yeah, it's interesting. The thing that I'm really enjoying doing is parts work, which is more from the Western tradition,
Yeah.
but I'm really experimenting with integrating it with Buddhist practice. And there's a few other teachers that have done this before me. So
Okay.
we can talk a little bit more about parts work is, if your audience isn't familiar, there's a few methodologies. So IFS is maybe the most popular right now, internal family systems, and the other one is voice dialogue. And the essence of these models of the psyche is that we don't have a unitary mind. We're not just one person. We're made up of many different parts.
Mm.
So we have a part of us that is a striver or a spiritual seeker. We have a part of us that is a controller or a protector. We have all these different competing parts that are very different energetically, and they have different views. They hold different traumas. So to me, it's my view on this now is that if done right, some of the parts work is very similar to this more advanced Tibetan Buddhist practice. It's almost like akin to them, to these practices, but it's a little bit more accessible for Westerners. And what I find is it gets people out of their heads if you do it right. They get into the felt sense of the body. They start to have this sense that the Buddhists talk about of no self or emptiness of self, where we're not this solid concrete thing that we take ourselves to be. I think doing parts work, people very quickly have that experience.
Mm.
And I also find that doing it correctly, people can very quickly shift into these more transpersonal states, which I think takes a little bit longer with traditional meditation. So it's
Mm.
interesting, like that's where this translation piece I'm really fascinated by. There's these Tibetan Buddhist practices of visualizing yourself as a Buddha, and they're super complicated and they're really interesting and powerful. I just find that they're not really accessible for people that don't want to spend that much time learning about Tibetan Buddhism and the rituals and the
And
practice.
hours,
But
hours
I
and
think the essence of it, I do think there's other ways to get to the same or a similar place. So yeah, the parts work is the stuff that I'm personally the most excited about right now.
mm. And is this because once you've done your parts work, so I'm fascinated by parts work and I love it. But I'm no expert. So again, correct me if I get any of this wrong. So am I imagining that, so once you've identified all your different parts and you've kind of gone, oh, look, there's that, the inner child or the controlling part or
Hmm.
there's all of these different parts of us that make us up as a unique person that we are with the inner battles and the, whatever that we have going on. And there's dialogue between these inner parts, which is also really, really fascinating. But once you've identified these major parts, I suppose, of yourself, because you've managed to kind of externalize them almost or
Hmm.
see them as a separate entity, what you're then left with is just that higher self, that inner quietness, that true soul part of you that you are searching for when you're in a deep meditation as a Buddhist. Is that what we're getting towards?
Yeah, yeah. There's a few ways. There's a few ways to get there in my experience. So
Mm,
one of the really fascinating things I've been trained in, it's a process called the Big Mind process, where a Zen master integrated parts work with Zen Buddhism. So basically, there's a way of using certain language where you're talking to parts or basically something that's not a part and inducing an experience that would take years to have on the cushion, essentially. So yeah, I mean, I think when you're doing each part and you're feeling the difference of it, there's something that's aware of all of it, right? So that you're having this spiritual seeker that we can all identify with if we're
mm,
into meditation, or these parts that aren't good enough, or all these different parts. But ultimately, shifting back and forth, there's also an awareness that is present with all of this. So there's ways to kind of talk somebody into that state so they have a little bit of a taste of it. And
mm,
what I find interesting about that is it can help to orient their meditation practice after. So I've been parts of communities where people sit on the cushion for years and years and years, and then they have some big opening, and then it recontextualizes what meditation is for them. And then they kind of have this epiphany, oh, this is what meditation is. It's not that they were doing it wrong, it's just it's a maturation process. It takes time to have an opening. Then their entire practice is different. I find parts work can get people there much quicker,
mm,
and again, but it's doing it in an embodied way where you're dealing with your own personal issues. You're not pushing them away. You're embracing them. The messiness of we all have our own internal struggles with the parts. It's not bypassing that. It's actually using that as a jumping off point into what is beyond all of it, essentially.
mm, mm. So is it a matter of getting to a place where you go, oh God, there's that part of me that's come up again and it's telling me I'm a failure or, whatever that part of, and rather than, going hearing that story, I'm a failure, whatever the story is, and going, yeah, I am, and that like really believing it and going, jumping into that well with that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Instead, you just go, oh, look, that's that feeling, and it's over there, and it's not actually who I am, or it's just a story that. So this is the kind of language that I use that I think that makes sense to me. Is like that's the
Hmm.
story. So that story is just a part of you, and when you can see it externally, when you have an awareness of it, because awareness is like 99% of all spiritual work in my
Hmm.
my experience
Hmm.
and talking to people
Hmm.
is awareness, is having an awareness of the fact that your, right knee is always hurting and what that means, or having an awareness of that story that keeps coming back. And the work for me is going back then from that sort of spiritual side of it, going, okay, it's an embodied action, an embodied thing that's happening. Where does that come from? And then going back and doing the more Western type of psychology is like, okay, so when did I begin to think that I was a failure? Who said that? Who made me, what little event happened in my life that made that a, a weight that landed and stuck with me? Because
Hmm.
people say weird things to you all the time, and some things stick, and they can be with you forever, and other things you could completely forget. A fascinating aspect of being a human. It's like, why do some things really hit home and other things,
Mhm.
whatever? Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Like coming back to what you said about awareness being the heart of these practices, I agree 100%. And the voice dialogue framework that I like is the term they have is the aware ego. So they make it a little different than there's awareness, which is just no sense of self. It's just without any boundaries. But the aware ego is kind of their version of a healthy ego. So
Mm,
it's more that the aware ego is allowing all of these parts to come up and is being present with them, but it's not clinging to them. It's not over identifying with them, but it's not pushing
mm,
them away either.
mm, mm,
So, even just making it really embodied, I notice talking to you, I can have multiple parts coming up today. I can have a part of me that feels imposter syndrome, but I can either fight it and push it away, or I can overindulge in it and fixate and oh my God, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not good enough to have this conversation.
yeah.
It's the aware ego process is more that's there. That's okay. But
Yeah.
their model is there's a polarity. There's another part that is more, I want to be an expert and I know so much or whatever. You're just allowing all of it to come up and you're being really present with it. So in these methodologies, the view is that we disown usually one part of that polarity. We over-identify with one and we disown the other, but they're both there. So it's more about being present with both of them. And it's more by listening and letting these parts talk, they start to kind of heal and transform on their own. So, our personality
Mm,
structures are basically made up from our core self that we really identify with. But the opposite of that is disowned, and that's kind of what causes problems or recurring issues in our life. So the work is more of re-owning those and being present with those. So they're just both they're all there, and it's yeah, again it's this internal balance essentially.
mm, mm. And it's really interesting. You've used the word embodied a few times, which I love because that speaks very much to, a lot of the work that I do. Starting as I am as a yoga teacher, I came to this work via yoga, so via the embodied somatic
Yeah.
felt experience. So because I often say, we are what our brains think that it's so clever and it can sort all of our issues out and all of our stuff can be sorted out if we just think about it hard enough, if we read enough books, if we listen to enough podcasts, if we like fill our brains with more knowledge and more ideas and so on. And yeah, there's huge merit to that. We're not going to begin to understand everything. We need to have a basic understanding. But I often say that I think that it's really important that we just let the body take care of this.
Hmm.
So we shake it out, we work it out, use our yoga, we use whatever physical practice we can to have that communication with this incredible machine that we have been given to live this tiny little short life out in. So when you're talking about embodied, and the physical side of it, is there any part of your practice that feels like it fits in with that side of things, like the physical side?
Yeah. So just relating it quickly to the parts work.
Mm,
Yeah, 100%, because you can be in the head too much. And I find sometimes working with people that are super oriented in the head, it's hard to get into these energies of the parts.
mm,
But if you tune into any of these parts, whether it's the seeker or the wounded child, it's extremely embodied.
mm,
It's in the stomach, it's in the chest, it's tension in the head. So sometimes practitioners will ask the person they're working with to really tune into the body first before they're talking from that voice. So yeah, absolutely. And the language that I use in the balancing with the meditation practice is it should be bi-directional. So you should be ideally doing a top-down practice and a bottom-up practice. So admittedly, I think a lot of Buddhist communities are more top-down oriented and they don't emphasize the body enough.
mm,
Some I've seen have real issues with that, I think, where it goes a little almost into dissociation, where it's,
mm,
you're witnessing and you have no preference, but your body's screaming something to you that you're being mindful of and you're letting it come and go.
mm,
So yeah, personally, I'm a big fan of the yoga tradition as well because I think it's just coming from that other bottom up part where you're working with the body directly. So yeah, I mean, even this morning I did yoga nidra to kind of balance my practice. I didn't sleep well last night. So there's not a way to think yeah, you can't think your way out of these problems.
Yeah.
There's a funny I don't know if you know The Onion, the satirical magazine. They had a fake headline that woman solves her anxiety by thinking about it really hard. So it's like it's so silly. Like our thinking mind is causing these problems.
Yeah.
So it's you can't just keep reading your books and fixate and change it. You have to try something different.
Yeah, that's really funny. That's brilliant because that is, I think, but you see that I think it encapsulates quite a lot of Western psychology.
Yeah.
We're going to fix you by thinking about it really hard, by talking about it a lot. And that doesn't always help us because we just go deeper and deeper into the woods, if you like. And yeah, we might find in deep in the woods a shining fire that's going to give us, an idea of where it all came from and give us a solution or a map or a path out of that. But yeah, I I think that's really funny because yeah, I think it's and the other side of this, which I find fascinating. So in the Western traditions, we're thinking our way out of this and we're using our brains and we're being quite grand, sort of like brain focused. In the Buddhism tradition, there is an image that could be exposed, told, which is you spend your whole life, up in the crown chakra, up in
Hmm.
this
Hmm.
woo, lovely, non-real world. And, so there's a sense of not living in the real world, essentially, head in the clouds.
Hmm.
When I'm dealing with people and reading chakras and so on, I find quite often that, there are some people who are just like really strong. Their third eye and their crown are wonderful, but they are not grounded. They have not got their feet on the earth. They are not sort of, stable in they don't not sort of making the most of the very human experience that we have. And we're capable of having it all. We're capable of being grounded and being creative and being strong and being loving and being spiritual and having that ability to touch into that spiritual side of us. But this is where I think this marriage between the Buddhism and the psychology is really interesting because when you find that balance, then that is, as you say, that's going to begin to become an embodied practice. Um, and it's so tell me more about your book and what you're offering people with your book, because I know you're in the middle of writing it, so we'll have to come back and tell me more about it when you've actually got it published and so on.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit. So the essence of it is I'm trying to answer the question of why do we suffer from the Buddha, how the Buddhists would answer that. And the argument that I have in the book is that there's three fundamental answers to that within the Buddhist tradition. They kind of map onto some of the other traditions that we talked about, but it's like a more of a fundamental answer and it gets more subtle. So it's almost like the difference between physics and quantum physics.
Mm.
Quantum physics is just it's going deeper and deeper and deeper. It doesn't negate physics. If you drop an apple, it still is going to fall to the ground, but
Yeah.
it's a more nuanced view. So the way that I talk about it is the first answer to why we suffer is because the mind is chronically reactive. So that's what we mentioned earlier. So the Pali term is dukkha. It's often translated as suffering. That life has this quality of suffering. My teacher translated as reactivity. So it's more psychological understanding. It's just the mind is we're always trying to grasp onto things and push away things, but we live in a world of impermanence. So everything is always changing and we're always changing. So it's this existential conundrum where we're trying to hold on to things for solidity, but there's nothing to hold on to. So
Mm.
that's basically that fundamental answer. And the solution to that is developing non-reactivity. It's acceptance and being present with everything because everything is always changing. There's nothing we can do about that. But if we can have a stability of mind and be present, we're not so tight about it. So this it's more of this relaxation and a being present. And then the second layer of depth is more it's this misunderstanding about the nature of the self and the external world, that our mind makes constructions. So basically, the analogy I use is the idea of a sensory bubble in biology, that every species has their own sense systems where they're all detecting a little sliver of the sensory data that's available. and then we construct a representation of the world, basically. But from the Buddhist language, it's we would say we make these constructions of the self and of the external world and even of time, but we think they're solid. We think they're real and that they exist outside of us. We don't realize it's just a representation that the mind is making. So from that vantage point, this sense of I'm different than you and the external world, and it's not really the way things are. So this brings in the language of emptiness, which basically means this deep interconnection, that things are deeply interconnected and we're not this sense of self that we take ourselves to be. So there's a different set of meditations to open that up, and including compassion meditation, because the natural result of understanding that is you have compassion because we're all so deeply connected. You can almost feel that. So that is, I guess, using the language that you teach from, it's more of the heart chakra. It's this intuition of we're feeling it. It's not intellectual. And then the third and final piece is more that we miss our true nature. So it's more that our true nature is this vast open awareness, which everything is always arising in. That awareness is ever present, but the contents are always changing. So that's kind of like the highest teaching in Tibetan Buddhism from schools called Dzogchen and Mahamudra is the traditional terms. But it's basically that this true nature is awareness. It's already enlightened. It's already free. It's already perfect, but we miss it. So we're so fixated, like your mother was saying, the navel gate, whether it's the navel gazing or if it's the chasing after a career, we fixate on the content of awareness, but we don't recognize awareness itself.
Mm.
So these, I think when they're practiced correctly, these are all complementary views. You can have a practice that integrates all of them. But the way that I talk about it is there's an increasing level of subtlety of understanding why we suffer. So yeah, the book is maybe 80 or 90% done. So it's the first time I've ever written a book. So it's been a fascinating experience. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of editing and revisions, but that's kind of the core idea. And then I introduced six different styles of meditation for kind of working with this. And then also like how do you actually integrate that in your daily
Mm.
life?
Mm. So, given that this is the Chakra Meditation podcast, and as you know, I offer guided meditations, and that is just one type of meditation. Just run me through the six different styles of meditation that you have, because so many people struggle. They go, I can't meditate, or there's so many people who have a misconception about what meditation is, and there's a type of meditation out there for everybody. So, hit me
Yeah.
with your versions.
Yeah, well said. And I sometimes say that the meditation is like almost like a class of terms, like it's like
Mm.
exercise. So there's a difference between boxing and jogging and swimming and yoga. They're all exercise.
Yeah.
But you know, an 80-year-old probably shouldn't take up boxing or powerlifting, but maybe swimming and yoga would be fantastic. So it depends on to your point. I think there is a style for everybody. So yeah, the main styles that I talk about is first is concentration, meditation. So that's different than mindfulness and that you're deliberately focusing on one thing intently and blocking everything else out. So there's different stage models of concentration in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So that's kind of like a preliminary practice. Let me think if I'm going to get these in order. The other one is motivational training. So these ones are really fascinating, but they're called analytical meditations. So it's a combination of using the intellect and visualization, but there's these perspective changing practices. And they're often used at the beginning of the practice to change your view on your life and meditation to motivate you to practice. So one of the more popular ones is a meditation on death and impermanence, where you try to basically realize that one day you'll die and you have no control over that. But it's meant to be a positive thing where it's a great clarifier, where you
Mm.
realize all these things I get really hung up on, they don't really matter. And on my deathbed, I'm not going to care about these things I'm so stressed about, and
Yeah.
helps you to reorient, to really commit to usually relationships and meditation and
Mm.
spirituality. So there's basically four different styles of the motivational practices. There's compassion meditations. So there's about four or five that I do there, which I think are probably a little bit more popular. Um, there is what is called emptiness meditation. So, as I talked about briefly, this idea that we construct an experience of reality and we mistake this construction as solid, emptiness meditation is a way of really examining your experience. So, for example, I take myself to be Bill as solid and different than everybody else that I interact with. In an emptiness meditation, it's more you're observing that. You're looking if you can find anything solid. So you basically can close your eyes. It's almost like a body scan, but
Mm.
you're directly looking at things that you take as solid and seeing if they're actually solid. And basically the goal of that practice is you start to see, oh, this actually it's more like there's this collection of things and this moving energy and these changing thoughts and emotions. And I just think it's more solid than it is, but it's almost like a river that's always flowing rather than this, frozen thing that I'm getting really attached to. Then the other one is called mentor bonding, is the term that I use. Basically, it's this style of visualizing yourself as an enlightened being. So this is more like the Vajrayana tantric practice. I don't get really into it, but it's the basic idea is that you're visualizing yourself as a being with qualities you would like to embody. So if it's you want to visualize yourself as being compassionate and patient and loving and all these things that you're trying to cultivate, the Western tradition with visualization tends to be more like not always, but tends to be more external oriented. So I'm going to manifest something or I'm going to visualize myself getting something that I want. This, in line with the Buddhist practice, we're focusing more on the subject rather than the object. So it's more, I'm visualizing myself as somebody with positive qualities. So, over time, you start to become like that. And it's called mentor bonding because you visualize an ideal mentor. So it could be the Buddha, it could be, Gandhi or somebody that you think it has these wonderful qualities you would like to be more like. And then the final one is more pure awareness practices. So that's more like the true nature piece. It's more trying to recognize that open awareness that's beyond any of the content of mind or the changing stream of experiences, that knowing awareness that is kind of the backdrop of our experience all the time. So yeah, I hope that wasn't a mouthful, but those are the six steps.
No, that was amazing. That was wonderful. And it's so fascinating to hear you describe those different types of meditation. Um, because they're to me they feel very beautifully grounded in the Buddhist tradition, which is wonderful because the Western side of it is like, well, walking can be a meditation, and you can do meditation with the music or that. Like, there's so many like lovely, useful but basic ways of meditation, but these are really nuanced and ones that you can really get deep into. So I'm going to be very much looking forward to your book because I think that's going to be a fascinating read. I
Thank you.
love this. I love everything that you've said, and I love this idea of bringing together the useful Western, what we know as cult, because it's cultural, really, isn't it? Psychology, that psychology stuff, which is very understood, and then just weaving in this extra layer. And I think it's really smart. I think it's a really interesting thing, and I'm fascinated and kind of almost pleased to hear that I feel that I'm kind of doing that in a way as well, without
Hmm.
even kind of thinking, knowing about it, but just sort of making this tradition of the chakras and yoga like really relevant and grounding and practical for Western people. So I think this is good. This is good stuff that you're doing, Bill.
Yeah, well, and I love the way that you're grounding the practice in the body so much from the meditation of yours that I've explored. I think that kind of solves a lot of these problems where I think some of the issues that Westerners have with meditation of being disembodied and being too on our heads, it's interesting because you don't see that as much in the Asian cultures where this is practiced. I think it's a uniquely Western thing.
And it's a
So,
cultural thing. I mean, I
yeah.
think that's it's a cultural thing. It's the culture that we're surrounded with from the moment we're born is indoctrinating that way of thinking and believing, and this is how we do it. And it's in the same way of like, well, this is how you hold a knife and fork. Like in the US, you might hold it differently to the UK, and then in India, they eat with their hands. And like, everybody's got a different way that it's just the way it is, depending on where you were brought up and the culture in which you were raised. But bringing them together, I think, is super valuable. Hill, it's been an absolute joy talking to you. It really has. Tell people how they can get hold of you and yeah, just give them all of your details of how people can reach out and also how are we going to know when your book's out?
I don't know when it will be out, so we'll see. But
Exactly.
um, my website is just billbelanger.com. So BELANGER.com. So I do work with individuals. I'll have some more events coming up, and then I have some free guided meditations. So I think when I get closer to publishing, I'll probably have a lot of that on the website.
Mm,
Yeah, and I'm going to probably
amazing.
continue to flesh that out. So as we mentioned, my work has been a little bit more in the corporate world, and I'm transitioning more to the meditation stuff. So yeah.
Nice. Well, I mean, it's good work because we all need it. The world needs more people pushing this out into the world, but we also do need corporate to toe the line and be aware of what's required for their the health and happiness
Hmm.
of their workers. So yeah, it's good work, Bill. Thank you. Yeah, so billbellinger.com and Healbright is your other company, which I don't know whether you've got a website for that or not. But anyway, by the by, that's all your contact details, I think. Yeah. So any last thoughts, anything, a little bit of wisdom for if you take into account that the majority of people who listen to this podcast meditate, who are interested in these things, what's your one like really golden tip when people go into their little space and they sit down for their meditation? What's your number one tip?
I don't know if I have any one golden tip, but I think the thing I just encourage people to do is to experiment and you know, basically trust that you have the wisdom inside yourself to figure these practices out and to get something out of them. So that's my main advice is to experiment, to trust yourself. And yeah, I think if you do that, you can find the practices that are the best fit for you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Bill.
Yeah, thank you.